can share this one?
Yeah, we can share that one.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for taking time from what's been a whirlwind summer and so many competing interests, but we thought we'd bring this great group out today and have some conversations about some important issues. My name is Richard Taylor, and I've had the pleasure of welcoming you on behalf of the Union Chapel Educational and Cultural Institute to our third Charles Ogletree Public Forum series this summer. Our mission is to at once honor our good friend, brilliant lawyer, scholar, and longtime Vineyard friend Charles Ogletree by convening leading thinkers to discuss the important issues of the day. We have a stellar panel this afternoon that has been assembled. Professor Deborah Archer is Professor of Clinical Law and co-faculty director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law at NYU, and she is also the president of the American Civil Liberties Union. Feature article, that's nice, yeah, very powerful. One of her feature articles recently is The New Housing Segregation, the Jim Crow Effects of Crime-Free Housing Ordinances. Duvalier Malone is an accomplished author, political columnist, motivational speaker, community activist, and CEO of Duvalier Malone Enterprises. Speaking on the importance of voting, Duvalier noted, elections have consequences. I believe the American public is more aware of this fact now. And he has also quoted the late John Lewis. The vote is precious. It is almost sacred, and it is the most powerful nonviolent tool that we have. Please give Mr. Duvalier. Michael Curry wears several hats given his range of professional, civic, and community interest. He is currently president and CEO of the Massachusetts League of Community Health Centers. After having served as president of the Boston branch of NAACP, he now serves on the national board of this venerable organization, and he is also an attorney. Please welcome Michael Curry. And finally, my Congresswoman, the Honorable Ayanna Pressley from District 7, including the Roxbury section of Boston, who defeated a multi-term incumbent to go to Washington. Her campaign theme in part was, those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. She was the very first black woman elected to Congress from Massachusetts, and that was also the same distinction she had serving on the Boston City Council, where she served 8 years before running for Congress. She serves on two of the most powerful committees in Washington, House Committee on Oversight and Reform and the House Committee on Financial Services. Please welcome all of them. My job is to stir up good trouble. How's that? Okay. So I'm going to begin by asking, I'm going to read from Eric Holder's book, Our Unfinished March. You got to get that on voting rights. Real powerful book. Yeah, please give Eric a hand. Great guy. He was here earlier this week. John Lewis, as I mentioned, which was quoted by Duvalier, the vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed you can lose it, end of quote. The right to vote is the basic right without which all others are meaningless, President Lyndon Johnson said when he signed the Voting Rights Act. So my question is, let me get to my notes here. Why is this right more important and more significant, let us say, than land, the right to own property, the right for a universal livable wage, right to read and to write, the right of reproductive health? Why is the vote so compelling?
Good afternoon, everyone. First and foremost, I just want to say how much I appreciate you and Chapel, appreciate you, Richard, certainly appreciate the august Charles Ogletree for being not just a justice seeker, but a justice deliverer. And the fact that all of you, in the midst of what should be a time of respite and restoration and leisure, have made the decision to come here says that each and every one of you are defenders of democracy. And so I want to thank you for that, because we really do need everyone to have a stakehold in our democracy. And in order to have that stakehold in our democracy, that has everything to do with equitable access to the ballot and the ballot box. And that work is not just for people with commas and titles after their names. That has to be the work of everyone. So hand clap yourselves. And so I'll just start it off and just very succinctly offer something, and then I'll pass it along. The reason why the vote matters, and not to be political, but I will quote my candidate for Secretary of State, Tanisha Sullivan. The vote determines elections, and the elections determine public policy. And as someone for whom policy is my love language, because every inequity, every disparity, every racial injustice is something that was legislated. It was codified in our laws. The moment we find ourselves in right now is one of coordinated, intersectional, legislated suppression and oppression. In the states that do not have states' rights and affirm that abortion care is health care, like Massachusetts, which did pass the Roe Act, so we are a safe haven state, there is a sort of oppression concentric circle. These are the same states that have passed some of the most draconian and discriminatory laws when it comes to LGBTQ rights, and also who have been the most active when it comes to voter suppression. So again, these things are all linked and coordinated. The final note that I'll offer is that what we see happening, and I'll get to some data points later about how many states have been engaged actively in this voter suppression, is consistent with the response throughout history. We saw a multi-generational, multiracial coalition decisively and historically, in the midst of a pandemic, deliver a Democratic majority across the board. What we see now is a backlash and a response to that. In the 1880s, in the midst of Reconstruction, Black folks were voting at 61%. When people began to see the ways in which that was disrupting the natural order of things, electoral power, racial hierarchy, they then began to legislatively put things into place to suppress that vote. So in the 1880s, Black folks were voting at 61%. By 1912, we were at 2%. So when I say that voter suppression is a tool of white supremacy, that is not just hyperbole. That's not an empty talking point. And so we do find ourselves in an unprecedented moment, which demands of us unprecedented organizing, mobilizing, engagement, voting, but it is not unprecedented. It's consistent with the algorithm. It's just unprecedented for our lifetime.
Give her a round of applause. Absolutely. So, one, I want to just join in my appreciation to be part of this panel. And Richard's a longtime friend and an advocate and activist, particularly around moving Black business. So I'm just honored to be on this panel. I want to recognize my colleagues in the NAACP, particularly in Martha's Vineyard NAACP, Dr. Lorna Andrade and her colleagues. Please give them a round of applause. I'm on the island now for this conversation, but I'm actually honored to be here on the same weekend that the national NAACP president and staff are here. There's actually a program that's happening simultaneous to this where President and CEO Derek Johnson is on the island as well, and we'll have some conversations this evening. So I am honored to be here with them. And lastly, not least, Dr. Ogletree, longtime friend, mentor, advisor, and the last time I saw him was just right outside this building with his beautiful wife, and had a chance to talk to him. So I'm humbled in this moment to think about my friend. I will tell you that when I became an activist in this work, actually when I became this, on my way to becoming CEO of the organization I represent, a white Irishman who ran the organization said to me, he said, Michael, the thing that black folks really need to get a sense for is if you're not at the table, you're on the table or you're on the menu. I'm gonna repeat that because you should tweet it. If you've not heard it before, you should share it because it's a powerful statement. If you're not at the table, you're on the table or you're on the menu. So when I think about a presentation I do across the country called Quantum Leap, I walk people through anti-black racism in this country from 1619 to today. And I'm constantly jumping back and forth in history, connecting the dots to why we have wealth inequality, why our kids are going to schools without the requisite academic rigor, why we are unbanked and unhoused, why we are over-incarcerated, because we don't connect those dots very well. So to Richard's question, when I think about my neighborhood, I wasn't a kid who came to the Vineyard. I was a housing project kid. I walked out my house. Most of the families around me were dying of diabetes, heart disease, and cancer at a higher rate, living to 65, 70. Most of the families around me, many of the men were incarcerated. All my uncles were in Walpole and Concord Street Prison. We spent growing up visiting them in jail. When I walked to downtown Boston, they followed you around the store. We didn't own those stores. We didn't own the businesses in our neighborhood. I didn't understand that. And then I'd travel to Alabama, where my family's from, or Birmingham, or Rochester, New York, or all over the country, and I would see black folks living the same way no matter where I went. Now, when you're 12 and 13 and 15, you can't make sense of that. You internalize that. Something must be wrong with us, because everywhere I go, we're living this way. We're dealing with the same circumstances. Are we not as smart to be CEOs? Are we not as qualified to own our own businesses? Or can we not become congresswomen and men and mayors? And I didn't get that context at that age. So for me, what happened was I finally made sense of it as I became a student of history, that voting matters. That if you're not at the table, you're on the table, or you're on the menu. That's why we vote. Because all those policy issues that Congressman Pressley and Richard talked about are driven by your opportunity to show up and exercise that franchise. We fought and we died for the right to vote. I have to tell young people, they say, well, I don't want to vote because it doesn't matter. They don't listen to us anyway. They're going to do what they're going to do anyway. If there was ever a reason to understand why not voting matters, this most recent presidential election proved it to many people. Policing was on the ballot. That we should have showed up if we wanted to change police reform in this country. If we want to do something about poverty in this country, you need to put people in office that will do something about poverty. If you want to invest in black businesses and businesses of color and change the situation that faces many people of color in this country, you need policymakers who are at the table and can champion those causes for you. So I think for me as an activist in all these years, I think about the 1965 Voting Rights Act as, quite frankly, the key significant civil rights legislation of the 1960s. Of course, the Civil Rights Act. Of course, all the other advancements, but the real strongest piece of legislation, because there were many others, I think Medicaid and Medicare were actually civil rights bills because they forced hospitals to integrate. But the key piece of legislation was the Voting Rights Act. Now, the problem with that is we weren't vigilant. Because as Ayanna said, Congressman Pressley said, with history, there's always these ebbs and flows of history. I called Reconstruction when I do presentation the Obama years. People always laugh when I say that because like Obama's win, we thought we made it. We thought there was an opportunity, but by 1890, as Ayanna said, they turned that back. They understood that this is chess, not checkers. And I know we like to believe people are good people, they have good hearts, but people feel like this is a battle for the soul of this country and that we need to keep them from voting. We need to keep them from the table. And I think that's what this is all about.
So I think a lot of what needs to be said has already been said. I used to work at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and my boss at that time was Elaine Jones. And she often would say, everything that needs to be said has been said, but it hasn't been said by everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say it again. I'm going to say it again. I think in terms of the importance of voting, I wouldn't say that it's more important than everything else, but it is protective of every other right that we have. And the most vulnerable communities are being targeted on multiple fronts. First, we are taking steps to disenfranchise them. And then after we've been disenfranchised, the result is an attack on our privacy, our bodily autonomy, our right to equal protection, our right to exist and to thrive and to live choice-filled lives, our right to be happy. And we've seen that time and time again over the last few years. We had historic protests in support of racial justice, and the response was efforts across the country, state by state, to limit the right to engage in protest, the right to ask for redress. We had incredible conversations about racism and systemic racism, broadening the scope, really finally calling America to account for the full breadth of anti-Black racism and anti-Black oppression. And the response were laws that sought to silence us, to silence children, to silence teachers, to impose an alternative reality in the form of anti-CRT laws. Anti-critical race theory, which has nothing to do with what they're doing, right? But they're using that as a slogan that has been really effective. We have seen really just heartbreaking attacks on LGBTQ members of the LGBT community, particularly trans kids who are just looking for support and love and the right to exist and be happy in the way that other children are. And all of that goes back to the right to vote. I think that we heard folks talk about the link between the right to vote and white supremacy. Traditionally, I think we framed it as the fight to protect access to the right to vote, particularly for the most vulnerable people among us, particularly for Black people. But today, I think we have to shift that and include that this is a fight to protect our democracy, to shore it up for everyone. Because as we've heard, democracy is a threat to white supremacy, and so white supremacy is a threat to democracy. There are people who would rather tear down every democratic institution rather than allow Black and brown people access to the ballot, access to our political process. I think in so many areas, as we've heard, we are fighting a battle of ideas. We are fighting over visions of justice, over visions of equality, over visions of access and equity. But none of that means anything if the people who have and exercise disproportionate political power can use that to keep other people out. Not only does that erect barriers to political participation, it's going to have the result of people not participating, of people feeling like there's no reason to participate. And that is how democracies die. When people believe that they don't have any political power, and even worse, when they may in fact be right. Democracies are fragile, and we need to work to protect it every single day. I have a lot to say about how we got here around the Voting Rights Act, but I think you're going to ask a question, so I'm going to save that and turn over to Duvalier.
Thank you. You know, when I look at voting through my lived experiences. As someone who was raised in poverty in Mississippi, I understood very quickly as a child that, you know, everything about me going to school where my books were older than my grandmother in some instance, right? And where we didn't have food, where we were impoverished because of the lack of political engagement. And so I learned very early on that voting was connected to how we live every day. I like to talk and shift conversations about voting to my generations and generations to come. One of the things, I was lucky to be raised by a grandmother who marched with Dr. King at Tougaloo College, who researched with Medgar Evers, who was a part of the civil rights movement in Mississippi, just because my parents had me a little older, so I was connected to the movement. But so many young people today do not understand how we got here. And Congresswoman Pressley, you elegantly, outlined that as we make steps forward, we have to educate the next generation of how important this really is, that it affects whether or not student loans are going to be forgiven. It affects everything about your everyday living. And we have to start breaking that down to voting, even in elections. I break down to young people that democracy starts even when we're in high school, when we select who's going to be our student government association presidents, right? Democracy starts there, and we have to find a way to get out of the walls of some of these conversations that we're having in here and break that out to my generation, where they're able to be more relatable to those conversations, where we're able to really say that if you don't go out to vote, the opportunity for a young person who's in poverty to go to school on a affordable education may not be given to you. That makes sense to everyday people. And we have to break down, the importance of voting to everyday issues, to say that if we're going to be able to have affordable health care for our elderly, then you're going to have to go and vote for your grandmother, right? This vote is about your grandmother, and we have to bring voting into a more simple way of how it affects everyday issues, how it affects whether or not you're going to have food on the table. We have to find out. And also, one of the biggest things that I think that people take away, they look at the Congresswoman who is initiating federal policy, but I like to always say that we have to also engage people of how important it is to vote at local levels. That when she initiates policy in Washington, that is implemented on a local level in a way that it reaches you. Climate change doesn't have to wait until it gets to my hometown of Fayette, Mississippi by the federal government. The mayor has the ability to do that. And when we start breaking these conversations down and to where it relates to everyday people, you will start to see that people will respond to voting because they understand how it's going to affect them every single day and how it affects their lives.
Very good point, Duvalier. You're saying that those of us who are pushing voting rights have to localize it, particularly for the younger generations. Makes good sense. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about the 1965 Act and give a little background. By 1965, concerted efforts to break the grip of state disenfranchisement had been underway for some time, but with only modest success. We saw murders in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and of course we saw John Lewis and others on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on March 7th, 1965, get beat by state capitol police. That, among other things, persuaded Johnson to push for the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, there were two particular sections of that act that have come under fire, or at least we're trying to respond to the environment. Section 2, which is amended the language of the 15th Amendment, applied a nationwide prohibition against the denial or abridgment of literacy tests on a nationwide basis. But Section 5, so-called Section 5 reference, covered jurisdictions where the federal government thought that states discriminated against African American voters. And so my question is, in 1965, was it fair from the beginning to identify, itemize, particularize certain southern states and have them be subjected to a special set of circumstances if they wanted to change voting regulations in their state? Let's start with that, then we'll go to Shelby.
I want to just say yes. and leave it at that, but I'll...
But?
Thank you for your sense. So absolutely. So Section 5 was considered to be the most powerful provision in the 1965 Voting Act. It was kind of prophylactic. And it said that any of these covered jurisdictions had to go to the Department of Justice or to the federal court in Washington, D.C., and get permission to make any voting change. And any change meant any change.
Just name those states if you would.
So I don't know all the states. It was a lot of states in the South, but it was also jurisdictions in the North. So parts of Alaska were covered. The Bronx was covered. It was focused on jurisdictions, whole states or communities, cities, towns, that had a particularly deep history of suppressing the right to vote on account of race. And not just against black folks. In the Bronx, it was discrimination against Latinx folks. In Alaska, it was discrimination against Native Alaskans. And so it was really powerful. If you wanted to move your polling place from the left side of the street to the right side of the street, you had to get permission. And what that meant was that nothing could slip under the radar. Someone had their eyes on every change to determine whether or not that was going to result in impacting the right of people of color to vote in that jurisdiction. And so the Supreme Court did not invalidate Section 5. Section 5 is still there. What they did was invalidate the coverage formula in Section 4, and it means that nobody is covered by Section 5. And as a result, there's no one checking. No one has a list of all the changes and can easily challenge those changes. Texas, for years, had been trying to pass their voter ID law, and it kept getting blocked by the Department of Justice. And they would refile every year, and it would keep getting blocked by the Department of Justice because of the impact it was going to have on people of color in Texas. The day after the Shelby decision was decided, Texas enacted its voter ID law, which had the result that we all knew it was going to have. It had the result the Department of Justice knew it was going to have, and it discriminated against people of color. And so now we've seen this proliferation of voter suppression efforts around the country because we've lost this incredibly powerful tool to stop them. We still have Section 2. Section 2 is an amazing provision. It prevents you from enacting laws that have the impact of denying or abridging the right to vote on account of race. But Section 2 has challenges. Section 5 happened before the law was enacted. So you didn't have to deal with the discrimination. You didn't have those discriminatory results. You can only use Section 2 after the law is enacted. In Section 5, the government would take the lead on challenging the provision. Section 2, private individuals have to take the lead. And litigation is expensive. The ACLU spent millions of dollars over years challenging Texas's voter ID law. It's expensive, and we can't catch everything. And again, we're missing things. Changes in school boards. On the local level, we don't hear about all of those things. No one's catching them, and they're just getting enacted without people attacking. Now we are seeing attacks on Section 2. What this court, the Supreme Court, has been really great at doing is death by 1,000 cuts. It is what we have seen with affirmative action. It's what we saw with Roe versus Wade up until Dobbs' decision, and it's what we're seeing now with the Voting Rights Act. Last term, they limited the application of Section 2, and this term we're going to see efforts to limit the private right of action of Section 2. So although we still have a little bit of the Voting Rights Act left, it's in danger as well, and I think so now it's in Representative Pressley's hands and her colleagues to try to fix the Voting Rights Act.
That's called passing the vote.
And maybe one addition to that, because I think Professor Archer covered that extremely well, is understanding what was the precursor to 1965, is that we relied on these court cases to address the discrimination in voting. So when we think about poll tests and character tests and all the other tools that was used in this conversation about white supremacy and keeping people from exercising the franchise, we needed federal action. And I think that's what they understood going into the 1960s, is we couldn't do the whack-a-mole with law. by waiting on cases which can be time, they can take time over the course of years to reach a conclusion. You needed federal action. I think what's interesting about Selma, as we talk about Selma, what really gave momentum, I think almost like I think about George Floyd, there's these pivotal points in history that push us forward. Selma pushed us forward, and the president and others, Lyndon Johnson, to take action at that time. So I think we are now realizing that when you fight for something, you have to fight to keep it, and you have to fight to build on it. Now, the problem with the law as it was presented and passed was it required the reauthorization, and I'm a policy person, a lobbyist for many years. Reauthorization means you fight, you win, and then you got to get right back up and fight for it again. Every 5 years. So the reality is it was already flawed in that we had to keep fighting for the reauthorization section. And we may get into this later. The same arguments around holding jurisdictions accountable was the argument in Shelby v. Holder that said things have changed. Things are better. We don't need this kind of protection. And you're holding states' jurisdictions under this oppressive rule that requires us, even if it's a minor change, to then file with the Department of Justice or the federal court. And it became an argument that the court actually took and considered for Section 5. So we have to really realize, I almost think of it, and I say this as a lawyer, I get frustrated when I look back on history because we should have predicted what was coming next. And we don't do that very well. We don't predict what's coming next, because if we did, we would have made sure legislatively that we had the protections in place to protect those Section 5. We didn't do that.
If I could just quickly add, I want to stress that something that you said, that the power of racism is that it is creative. It evolves.
Yes.
And Section 5 meant that we didn't have to think about how creative they were going to be in their racism, that it took away that whack-a-mole. But on Section 5, I just want to say on behalf of the civil rights community, I think we knew it was coming. We knew the challenges were coming. We had the Mudd decision the year before, and even before that, we knew that the Roberts Court was looking to do this. And so in defense of the civil rights community, I think we tried. There were efforts to lay a record, to lay a foundation in every case that we were filing 5, 6, 7 years before that, saying, here's why, here's what they're still doing in this state, here's all the discrimination that we've seen, the many ways that they are still oppressing black people and other people of color in this community. The court did what it wanted to do because it wanted to do it. And so I think a challenge is that we have to recognize that. With Dobbs, they had the ability to end the right to access abortion care, so they did. This is a different court that we're dealing with than the courts in the past. They have power, they know they have power, and they're going to exercise that power in ways that are unprecedented. And so I think we just have to also be realistic about the power that is in the hands of this court now, even despite our best efforts.
I want to come back to what I term the over-reliance on the Supreme Court and the federal government, historically. I'll come back to that. But one of the data points, oh, you want?
Sorry. Okay.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
And I'll make this very brief. Okay. So just because so much has already been addressed, so I'll just sort of cherry pick a little bit. So it's just my personal opinion. We need to expand the Supreme Court. The far-right extremism and the imbalance there, I know there are some who might think that a radical notion. There is precedence for this, and Richard knows that I believe in being radical, but according to the Angela Y. Davis definition, which is to address things from the root, and this root needs to be pulled up. It is completely imbalanced. They are overturning and obstructing the will of the people. They have done it on voting rights. They've done it on housing justice. Now they're doing it on reproductive justice and bodily autonomy. And to Professor Archer's also Duvalier's point there, yes, this is consequential at every level of government. So this is why your Secretary of State matters. This is why your elections commissioner matters. This is why your mayor matters. And I do just want to take a moment to lift up the leadership of Chairman Benny Thompson and what he has been doing with the
Amen.
January 6th
Brilliant
Select Committee. Is he an Omega?
Yes, he is.
Okay, all right.
As is Clyburn. As is Clyburn.
Okay, there you go. And I'll talk some more about some work we've done together, all three of us, on this issue. But, you know, there's no way when we're sitting, the underlying issue here is that democracy is dying. And it is dying in front of all of us. Every marker is there. The polarization, the coordinated, the surgical precision and attacks. And we know, this is why I'm so grateful you all are here and why we need you to continue to be engaged. And in a moment, I hope to have the chance to talk about what's happening in Massachusetts, since all politics are local. But we know what happens with inaction. We know what happens with inertia. Insurrection. Insurrection. And so with the slow death of democracy and Republicans trying to stop voters of color by any means, this is happening right now. This is why I love that they're taking photos from the early chapters of the civil rights movement. I hate when folks say during the civil rights movement. We're still in it. You cannot tell me that Black lives matter if you don't believe that Black voters matter. We are still in the civil rights movement. And I love that they're taking those black and white photos and they're colorizing them so people understand that this is not abstract. This was not that long ago. And we are still in that long march. Right now, Republicans are using redistricting to dilute Black political power. Right now. They are purging voter rolls of infrequent voters. They're getting rid of mail-in voting opportunities. And they're intimidating voters with criminal laws if you make a mistake on your ballot. And this has been the course of action since the Supreme Court decision in Shelby County. So I'll stop there, but I did just want to say that about the Supreme Court. And for those of you who are electorally involved and very focused on our Senate, we like to say, you know, give us 52 and see what we can do. I hope that you will support candidates for Senate who are vocalizing a commitment to abolish the filibuster, because this Democratic majority-led House has twice passed legislation that would address all the things we're talking about. I won't get too wonky and unpack each part of it, but the People's House has done its job, and the Senate has not done theirs because of the Jim Crow filibuster.
I want to go back to one earlier data point on perhaps the basis for turning back Section 5 as it was. And that was the election, 2 terms, President Barack Obama, and the overwhelming number of participation of voters of color and others for that election. I believe that was a data point that was cited in those cases. Please speak to that data point. I mean, the bottom line was, wow, if that happened and so many people voted, we must no longer have a problem. I hate taking these positions, but I'm the moderator. So speak to that election, please, in terms of your approach to Section 5.
Okay. So I think, yes, that was a data point, that we've elected a Black president. Look how far we've come. We have heard recently a similar data point in response to calls for election reform, that, look, Black people, other people of color voted in record numbers. You all, there were lines out the door, and so it's not a problem. You all are voting. But that is not a sign that our system is working. It is a sign that there are individuals, nonprofit organizations, that are going through extraordinary measures to make sure that people have the right to vote. And that shouldn't be the case. Our government should not be making it harder for people to vote. Our government should not be blocking the door for those most marginalized among us and forcing private individuals to step up and fill that void and ensure that people have the right to vote. I'll turn it over. That's it. Yeah.
And so one of the things I want to point out here as well is I was researching some data sets. My homegirl, Stacey Abrams, of course, is running for governor. And do we not know that during her race, that 53,000 people in Georgia, their vote was called in error because of name errors.
That's right.
53, and 90% of those were people of color, right? And so we're talking about black people that are going to vote, but they're up against all these administrative tasks that are becoming so consuming at the state level. And so that's why it's so important that we break down and we educate our communities on these administrative tasks, because the form of voter suppression now, it looks more simple, you know? And so we're not talking about people dying for the right to vote anymore, or the opportunity to vote. But we're now talking about, you know, we look at it like, oh, a name was spelled wrong. That's not a big deal. I'm sure that got fixed. We're talking about 53,000 votes that could change an election. I just want to drop that data set here for people to realize how important it is at every level of government that we are engaged in, especially local government. It's important. I think it reaches the people. Like 53,000 people could have changed the election, and that's one of the reasons why Stacey Abrams never conceded, not the legal standpoint of it, but the administrative part of her election, because we had 53,000 votes.
I want to pick up on that in terms of Massachusetts, because again, this fight is not abstract or national. If you call Massachusetts your home, although the state of Massachusetts is making strides in the right direction by recently passing the Votes Act and consequently enshrining vote by mail, early voting, and, because I want to make sure when you talk about the fight for voting rights, I'll say for me, it's important to me that we're also talking about those that are incarcerated. Because again, if we're going to talk about the larger frame here of white supremacy, we know the role that mass incarceration plays in that, further compounding our disenfranchisement. And so in Massachusetts, again, we've enshrined vote by mail, early voting, and jail-based voting into state law. So these measures are proven to expand access to the right to vote and preserve our democratic process and ensure that no voter is left behind. However, to the point that data set from Georgia, Massachusetts had an opportunity to also enact same-day registration and to further boost turnout among black and brown communities. Same-day registration ultimately did not pass in Massachusetts. It did not pass in our state legislature, leaving a massive barrier in place for voters. And one more data point on that, statistically, same-day registration mostly impacts folks who arrive to vote day of, who are only turned away due to an error in or out-of-date registration. So same-day registration allows mistakes such as an incorrect middle initial, apartment number, or similar inaccuracy to be fixed at the polls. So if you believe that Black lives matter, then you must believe that the Black vote matters, and we would certainly benefit from same-day registration. So please, if you're concerned about this fight and the preservation of our democracy and our enfranchisement, please learn more about this fight and get involved so that the state legislature can pass same-day registration.
If I could just quickly pick up on something that you said about Stacey Abrams' election and link it to something that you said about Secretary of State. One of the challenges in Stacey Abrams' initial election was that the Secretary of State has so much control of the election and was purging the voter rolls of Democrats who we can presume would have voted for Stacey Abrams. And I think that is why we need to focus on Secretary of State elections, which traditionally we have, kind of not paid attention to at all. There's incredible control in that position, incredible power to determine who has access to the ballot. If you look at Pennsylvania and the election for governor there, the Republican candidate for governor has said that if he is elected, he has a Secretary of State in mind, because he gets to appoint that person, and he has promised that he is going to end absentee ballots. He's going to end registration, same-day registration. But even more so, he is going to unenroll everybody in the state of Pennsylvania and force them to re-register to vote in the hopes that Black and brown people are not going to be able to navigate all the hoops that we now have in front of them to access the ballot. So you really do need to pay attention to Secretary of State elections. And then to think about the underlying cause of some of this this push to disenfranchise folks. It is so many people. There are so many people who are being disenfranchised because of small things. The middle initial is wrong. The address does not change. But the narrative that we hear is that it's about voter fraud. And it's not about voter fraud. This narrative of voter fraud, deep voter fraud in communities of color, deep voter fraud in other marginalized communities, is a tool that has been used to justify suppressing the right to vote and excluding people of color from access to the ballot. So we need to push back against that narrative to hear more about what's actually happening, how these tools are actually keeping people from voting for minor mistakes. It's not about fraud. It was never about fraud.
Maybe,
Quickly, one of the other things that people need to be aware of as well is that as these third-party organizations are traveling across your states and they're registering people to vote, you also have election commissioners and state leaders who understand and they see the data that the voter registration is up in these particular precincts, but they're not expanding the opportunity for more voting machines so that people can vote very easily. And so when we talk about local and state government, it is very important that we hold them as accountable as we hold our partners in Washington, right? As you know, I live in D.C., and so we hear all about the complaints from the local and the state level, but we have to open up people's eyes that at the state and local level, you're having individuals who are, strategically not expanding those precincts as an opportunity to, disengage voter, the opportunity to not vote early in states. It is a tool that is used to make sure that the African-American vote is suppressed. And all of these things are a modern way of voter suppression.
and just to add just a little bit, so one is to Professor Archer's point about we create these extraordinary circumstances just to show up and vote. Our systems are outdated across the country. So one of the things the NAACP National has been advocating for is updating our election systems. Standardizing what states do around elections is a critical part of that. I always used to joke about, so maybe one quick thing, I think about Ayanna when she said about our prisons and the right to vote. A good friend of ours, Richards and Ayanna's Sheriff Tompkins, Suffolk County Sheriff in Massachusetts, Boston, Suffolk County. He invited me to come speak to the inmates at Suffolk County. And it was during one of the elections where Ayanna was running. And I remember I was standing in front of the room, the guards left and locked the door, and I'm at the front of the room. And we started to have a conversation. And when I tell you I'd never seen this before, they were all engaged in her election. They were all thinking about how they wanted to vote for her and how they're tracking the issues. I'm not even exaggerating. They were engaged voters. Now, we shouldn't have to rely on a dynamic personality, a brilliant woman, a Barack Obama, to motivate people to show up and vote and then to overcome those obstacles. We have to demand that our system be updated. Now, when you think about the 2008 presidential election, this is broader than people of color. What is that, 58% of voting age population showed up? In your average election, you'd be lucky to crack 50% of the voting age population in this country. Americans generally don't vote. So we have a bigger problem than about making voting accessible for poor, marginalized people. There's an issue about voting in this country. We do not open up the franchise. Now, I want to end it on this point. It is chess, not checkers. And I know people say that, but I need you to understand chess is about a strategy. Chess is about knowing the move and the counter move. That's how insidious this is. That if you sit around thinking, well, I don't think that people have bad intentions, then we lose. So you have to show up, and to my earlier point to the professor, it's not just about those civil rights activists, and I've been in the rooms with Professor Ogletree at a Harvard event he convened around this topic, and National NAACP. The legal community, the civil rights community knew what was coming, but we need to be in lockstep with our legislative community. We need to be in lockstep with the voters to say, if we don't do this, we lose in these ways. That's what I think we failed on. Last but not least, around Donald Trump. And if any of you copy this, I'm gonna say that you stole it from me, I'm gonna sue you. I've said about Donald Trump that he tapped into that population of white Americans that don't vote, typically. And I said I'd love to draw that caricature that you see in the newspaper of a bus, a yellow bus, with Donald Trump driving it, hair all over the place, looking crazy, and Republican leadership in the bus looking terrified in that first clip, because he's just hijacked their bus. They don't like him either. They know he's a narcissist. They're actually worried about him. But the signs ahead of the bus is repeal Roe v. Wade, anti-Black Lives Matter, no gays in the military. So by the time it reaches that next slide, they're starting to sit down in their seats. Behind the bus is all those white folks and others who've been feeling locked out of the systems, who are frustrated by all these other issues, and they're running behind the bus and along the street of folks like us, terrified of what we're watching. And then there's a cliff. So I think ultimately we've not paid attention that this was coming. This was, if we know history, this is always the backlash to progress. People tap into that discontent, that frustration. I teach a class called Persuasion. You tap into that motor appeal, that sense of ad misericordiam, the sense of pity, the sense of security, that they're going to take your jobs, your education, they're going to rape your wives. And it's always worked. Throughout history, it's always worked, in Nazi Germany or in the United States of America. So we have to really be intentional about how we address voting and get people to show up. And I think, quite frankly, to Duvalier's point, I'm a dude who I really like to make sure that there's a cat standing on the corner right now, and I can make the case for him why he needs to show up. We've failed at doing that.
Okay, I have to say something. Well, so I want to say something, particularly with these three black men that are up here, and this is something that I'm very focused on because it's been bothering me, and I know the Abrams campaign and others have been focused on it. You know, shout out to the outsized, seemingly, not outsized, but there's a dominant narrative right now in terms of the role that black women have played on the ballot and at the ballot box. And you know, we're reclaiming our time. We are deserving of that acknowledgement, and again, in the role that we are playing. Shout out to people like LaTosha Brown, co-founders of Black Voters Matter, and many others. I struggle because I believe that the role of black men as defenders of democracy, particularly for the Democratic Party, has been all but erased. It's not just black women that are the most reliable voting constituency, it's black people. And true enough, black women have voted at higher rates, but we also owe a debt to the role that their brothers have played in defending this democracy in the midst of great undermining. And I think it is very important. Some of the malaise and sort of atrophy and apathy about voting, in my opinion, what contributes to voter suppression is when we do not advance public policy that people can feel. I cannot pretend that public policy is not a part of this. Elected officials cannot talk people out of their lived experience. If you tell me under a Democrat or a Republican, I can't get a job, I can't get a federal contract, I don't have access to health care, why would they be motivated even if we were successful in advancing the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act? We can't talk people out of their lived experience. Instead, we have to meet their basic needs, acknowledge that policy is not static, it is dynamic. It determines if people live, if they die, if they survive, if they thrive, and they have to feel the impact. So they don't question whether or not their government sees them and is legislating on their behalf. And I think that there is some onus for us in that. So I wanted to lift that please don't allow black men to be erased from the role that they've played in this democracy. And may we continue to champion the need for us to advance policies that are meaningful, that are transformative, and that are intersectional. I do not believe when people don't show up, it is because they are ignorant and apathetic and don't know any better. It's not what they don't know, it's that they know too much. They knew too much based upon their lived experience every day. There's a deficit of trust and undermining of faith and belief in institutions from the Supreme Court all the way to the White House. And we have to address that because that, too, is contributing to voter apathy and, in turn, suppression.
The last two comments have begged sort of my final question, and we're going to have some Q&A. And that turns to what we now call the two-party system. What is going on inside the Democratic Party with respect to future leadership, and what is going on in the Republican Party with respect to having the party being kidnapped? And where do we end up, if we can, when there is, in fact, bipartisan working relationships, both in the state legislatures and in Congress? Where are we with this two-party system? It seems fractured, not even fragile, but fractured. Can we speak to that, please? Don't all jump at once.
I just spoke, so I do want to have some equality of voice here. Y'all can offer opinions. Anybody? No. Okay. You want to say anything?
Your space.
Okay. I think what I'm struggling with is that when you talk about a frame of bipartisanship, it infers that we are operating with an equivalency. That we're operating from another time where there was a Democratic Party and a Republican Party, and there was just a differing on public policy. This is not an equivalency. This is not an equivalency when you have people serving in Congress who aided and abetted insurrectionists while I was on the floor of my office in the dark, barricaded. And a mob seized the Capitol, brandishing anti-Semitic flags, anti-Semitic T-shirts, Confederate flags, and erected a noose on the west lawn of the Capitol. And people aided and abetted those insurrectionists in seeking to undermine the integrity of free and fair elections. And again, we know that that is also on the path to the death of democracy. So when these are people still walking the halls of and serving in Congress, that is why the role of this January 6th Select Committee is so important. There must be consequences. There must be accountability. So when people are watching cable news and Monday morning quarterbacking with one another, I wish these folks could just get along, this is not an equivalency. I will work with anyone in the name of progress. But it is very challenging to work with people who mean you harm, to work with people who are operating in fiction and not fact, and to work with people who have been complicit in or accomplices to the undermining of that which is fundamental to our democracy, and that is free and fair elections.
Having said that, how do we support Liz Cheney, who, and others who, for example, several who voted for Judge Jackson to sit on the court? There seems to be some portion, we all agree small, that is trying to break away and recapture the party. Am I overstating this? Am I just in some illusion here?
And it's not even about how do we support them. When we take the oath of office to protect and to defend the Constitution of the United States of America, it is every lawmaker, it is every public servant job to protect and to defend the Constitution of the United States. So we should not be giving, we should not be giving extra flowers to any lawmaker for doing their jobs. And so I think we really, we should not. And I think what we have to do, I think as Democrats, we have to do just what the Congresswoman did here today. We have to take that message and paint a message to the American people of what really happened January 6th, what's really happening, why we have all these, legislations that have been passed by the House, and why we can't get them passed in the Senate. We have to start messaging that. And it's not just on lawmakers to message that. It's on each and every one of us in here today to pass that message out. And I know we hear a lot that the Democratic Party has a messaging problem. I think we have to take owners of that who are a part of this conversation, this engagement today, to say, how can we own a part of this puzzle and talk to that person on the side of the street, to talk to that person that may not have the same ideas as I do, to try and convince them to go and vote and to be more engaged. I think we all got to take a sense of ownership, but I don't agree with giving any kind of flowers of support to any Republican or Democrat for doing their job to protect and to defend the Constitution of the United States of America.
And I will tee up what I believe what Ayanna would want to say too, is that for any of us who've been doing policy work for a long time, and we know what Liz Cheney's policies were, that we know what that we know what Mitt Romney's policies were, our former governor, are in Massachusetts. We were fighting against Mitt Romney's policies even when he was here in Massachusetts, the lack of diversity in his administration. We know that many of these folks that have now become heroes and sheroes in this movement against Trump were also advancing policies that hurt black folks, that hurt poor people, that hurt immigrants. So we can't lose sight of that, because they can't become heroes now in the moment because it's relative, right? Because now it's so extreme, now we want to put them out as heroes. So I struggle with that and try to make sure try to make sure that we correct the record. Now, I am thankful as a person who we needed to see Republicans come out and speak truth to evil, if I can call it that, evil. And Liz Cheney, I celebrate when she does do that. I celebrate when others do that. But I don't forget about our policies.
Just one more thing I just want to give credit to the Biden administration and just acknowledge this. In light of the fact that the House, again, in passing those two pieces of legislation, and we were obstructed by the Jim Crow filibuster, and so we weren't able to pass it in the Senate, the Biden administration, they have taken important steps, including signing an EO, an executive order, to make it easier to register to vote, and creating a voting rights task force in the Department of Justice, which is what myself, Whip Clyburn, Congressman Mondaire Jones, and the CBC are asking of Attorney General Garland to use the full force of his agency to protect voting rights. Because we do know that in states like Texas and Florida and Georgia, that they're doing all they can to limit black folks from voting, and so we have to do everything we can to stop them. But I wanted to let you know, despite the obstruction by Senate Republicans who seem to have contempt for everyone who calls this country home, that in the face of that obstruction, that the Biden administration has acted.
Let's give the panel a hand. Before we go to Q&A, and Louise Johnson, Louise, raise your hand, please. Louise. She's got the floor mic, so if you have some questions. But I wanted to say this. Tomorrow, same time, same station, we will have a panel on black philanthropy, catalyzing community change, for us by us. Bakari Sellers will be the moderator. Vi Lyles, Mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina. We're keeping McQuarrie from our own New Commonwealth Fund. Vlada Fulworth from Philanthropic Collective in North Carolina. John Jackson from the Schott Foundation. And Aisha Alexander Young from Giving Gap. So please come back tomorrow and bring some with you to talk about black philanthropy. Louise, you had a question to the left, please, I think. Yeah. Just state your name, please.
Wanda Spivey from Cincinnati, Ohio. 2 points. One, the Congresswoman talked about public policy. And I think this is critical for the African American community to move past politics to policy. We focus a lot on personalities and not so much on policies. And I think what we need to talk about more is we're in support of anyone who does what we want them to do. To that, I will say about Liz Cheney. In terms of public policy, there's a theory of interest groups, which means we do not have to agree with you on anything. But if you agree with us on this one important thing, we will work with you on this thing. So I'd like the panelists to talk more about the importance of public policy versus politics, and about aligning with people who will serve our interests on any one particular item where we need them, regardless of whether we agree with them on other items.
I'm gonna let Michael start, and then I can come in the rear.
Maybe a quick comment. So in my 6 years as president of a branch of the NAACP in Boston, in my work, and I chair the Advocacy and Policy Committee for the National Board of NAACP, I think if there's many lessons I've learned over the years, and we in the NAACP say no permanent enemies and friends, just permanent interests, right? We want to make sure we're working with people who can advance our cause, our mission. So I think of that, I think of the work that we did in the NAACP, particularly here in Boston. I worked with our second black governor in the country, Deval Patrick. I've worked with Mitt Romney. I've worked and continue to work with Governor Baker on health equity issues. We're meeting right now to talk about how do we address the weathering we've become to the high rates of disease and death, morbidity and mortality in communities of color. So am I a fan of many other policies of our governor? No. But we'll work with him to advance health equity. So I think we have to be very astute in our policy work to understand that no matter who's there, no matter who's at the table, no matter what party, if we can sit down with you in advance, as they just did in Congress, let me change that. They did not do that with the Republicans. But we across the country understand, and particularly in NAACPs, that we're working within systems where we have to find some ability to work with people that we typically don't agree with to advance legislation. I think that's critical. I will tell you there's a lot of people who can't do that. That will literally draw a line, and we see it in Congress, will draw a line and said, I can't work with you on anything because I don't agree with you on some things. I know that we often talk about that is disastrous for the causes that we care about.
I plus one everything that you said, and I have had the honor of a lifetime to serve as the president of the ACLU, and we are a nonpartisan organization, and we are willing to work with folks on both sides of the aisle if that's going to advance our goal. If working with someone we don't agree with 90% of the time is going to help us deepen and expand the protection of civil rights and civil liberties, then we're going to do that to advance that issue. Another goal of ours is to bridge the gap between the America that was promised and the America that is. If there's someone who wants to work with us to do that, we're going to work with them to do that. What the ACLU will do later on is after you work with us, when you go back to being who you are 90% of the time, we will then come for you on those issues. But to the extent that we can work together, we do work together.
Yes, and I would just second that or third that. First and foremost, I want to say all my people are from Cincinnati, and if you came here without any Skyline chili, we really gonna have problems. I know it's hot, but it's always time for Skyline chili. First and foremost, as I said, one of the ways that we combat apathy and cynicism and malaise is by advancing bold, meaningful, deeply felt policy. And I think that we have to engage in a politic not of transaction, but of transformation. That's a big part of the problem, is that if you are only engaging an electorate in an election cycle, and the first thing you're doing is asking them for their vote, when you haven't asked them anything about their lives, their struggle, their aspirations, sought their counsel for innovation. Richard mentioned the first part of my mantra, but the latter part is the people closest to the pain should be closest to the power, driving and informing the policy making. I believe in cooperative governing. I don't write a bill, co-sponsor a bill, vote on a bill without working cooperatively with those closest to the pain. Again, I'm willing to sit at the table with anyone in the name of progress, while also recognizing that no one piece of legislation, not even reparations, is going to undo centuries of harm. It is going to require a sustained effort. And Stacey Abrams, one of my favorite quotes of hers, is she reminds us that we do not elect saviors, we elect partners. And so ultimately, when you are casting a vote, you are, as a voter, as the head of an organization, are saying, who do I want to partner with? And part of partnership, and Professor Archer just spoke to this, is accountability. But for me, I want to see folks that are committed to canceling student debt in some iteration, because Black borrowers are disproportionately burdened by that. Someone committed to addressing the Black maternal morbidity crisis, someone that's going to champion economic justice and prosperity and minority business entrepreneurship and enterprise, Black home ownership, my legislation that I partnered on with Derek Hamilton and Cory Booker, baby bonds, the American Opportunity Act. So these are some of the things that I'm looking at, but I think we have to be honest. There's no one bill that's going to undo centuries of harm. It's going to require sustained effort. We've legislated hurt and harm. Now we have to legislate equity, healing, and justice, ensure that the value of Black lives is codified in every budget and also in our policies.
Hi, my name is Harry Chelf, and I'm from College Park, Maryland. And I want to say first, I watched with great anxiety this past winter what was going to happen at the federal level with the voting rights legislation that was before Congress, and watching the public pressure build up. And ultimately, I was heartbroken, like probably all of us here, that we didn't even get a scintilla of voting rights legislation at the federal level. But what was also heartbreaking was to see, in the whole year leading up to it, since the insurrection, to see not a strong enough groundswell of public support in favor of strong federal voting rights legislation. Perhaps it was because of apathy, either amongst the Democratic base or even just independent voters. And I know there's no silver bullet, but I hope that we can start to frame to the American voter, and I don't just mean Democratic voters, voters who consider themselves Democrats, but to the whole the whole country, that, like you said before, this is a freedom issue. This is about the freedom to vote. And that's the fundamental freedom, because all others come from that. So can we find a way to drive home this message of this is about freedom, which is something that we Democrats too often, in my view, shy away from, because we think, well, only Republicans like to talk about it. But they're the same people who are trying to take our freedoms away. So how can we drive that message?
Yeah, I agree. And again, I can't speak for an entire party. I can just, offer my own experiences as someone who's been a proud Democrat since I was in utero. That I think, to the message, discipline, challenge, and issue that the party has long faced. Unfortunately, we have ceded, some issues. No one party has a monopoly on family values or freedom or what other issue could
Choice.
Or choice or patriotism. They have been so disciplined in that messaging that it's all but been co-opted, as if that only belongs to one party. And when we talk about abortion rights, again, abortion is health care. And this is as much about bodily autonomy and deciding when or if to start a family. But abortion is health care. The states like Kansas, where people were very surprised that they affirmed that right on the ballot, is because their messaging and their campaign was about freedom and privacy. And so as people were sort of stereotyping and making assumptions, well, for people who care about, civil liberties, and this is not going to be, but that actually, they did show up. And so Vice President Harris, I recently hosted her in the Massachusetts 7th, back home in the city of Boston, and we had a strategy meeting about how we can ensure that throughout the country in states that will have abortion care on the ballot, that we are employing and engaging similar strategies and tactics. Anyone else?
I will, and I said choice, and I meant right to life, that people have co-opted what right to life means, and we need to push back against that. But narrative change is an important part of the work that we have ahead of us. You mentioned Kansas, the ACLU spent a lot of time and invested in focusing that message and what is going to resonate with folks. And we've done a lot of work on figuring out what the messages that resonate with folks around voting rights are. And you're right, framing it as freedom and democracy appeals to many people. Talking about race makes some people not want to support legislation, even if it's the same exact legislation. But I think that's a challenge that we have. Yes, we want to be successful. We also want to speak truth to power. And if it's about race, we need to say it's about race. That has gotten us where we are today, in part, for us not having honest conversations about racism that is infecting every single system and structure in our society. And so I want us to talk about freedom. I want us to talk about shoring up democracy for everyone, but I also want us to talk about race, because so much of this is driven by race.
I'm Leslie Bryan, and I'm a proud Georgia voter. Thank you for highlighting our 53,000 exact match people.
Vote early and often.
Please don't. Vote once. What I'd like to talk about is standing up the stories of some of those 53,000 people that you talk about, because when you listen to the stories, and I've had the privilege of listening to some of these stories over the last few years, when you listen to their stories, you hear the story of the 92-year-old black woman who'd been registered to vote in the city of Atlanta since the 1960s. And when she tried to vote in 2018, she couldn't. She was told that she was not registered to vote. It turned out when the Atlanta newspaper investigated her story, her name was similar to a newly registered voter in a South Georgia county, and they pulled her registration down to that South Georgia county. You'll also hear the story of the young black man with a very common last name who was told not once, not twice, but 3 times that he was purged from the voter rolls because his name matched that of a convicted felon. And you hear the story of the woman, the Asian American activist, who took an elderly Vietnamese woman to vote, and the elderly Vietnamese woman had her naturalization papers that they required her to show. But because she, like many in the Vietnamese community, had 4 separate names, Georgia's computers couldn't handle her names, and therefore she fails under exact match. And then you hear the story of the football coach from a South Georgia county, South Metro County, who was told, no, you're not registered to vote down here in Coweta County, you're registered up in North Fulton County, and so you gotta go up there. Now, the man had never been in that part of North Fulton County, and he wasn't gonna drive, but that day he said, I'm tired, I don't wanna do this. But then he thought about the struggle of the people who had come before him, and he said, I'm going to take the time to drive an hour and a half up to the north end of the other county and drive back home just so that I can cast my vote like they told me should. So we have to remember to listen to the stories of those individual voters, because they're the people who are going to do what you say and motivate the rest of us to get something done in this fight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Ryan Wagner. I am originally from Memphis, Tennessee, but I live in Florida now. You've already probably heard everything that's happening in Florida, so I won't go over it here. How do you navigate? I work in the policy arena at my job, and so oftentimes I have the luxury of seeing what's coming before it makes it to the ballot or your average voter. And what I typically will see is there's a disconnect between the grassroots work and the policy work. And I know that sometimes when you're in a thing, you don't see the gaps until after everything's over. So how do you all in your work navigate the disconnect, particularly with young people who keep being told to go vote when they did, and they're not seeing the fruits of that labor and feeling like you're gaslighting them?
I think is, I think it's important to bring them to the table. So many times when I'm traveling across the country, what I hear is that, you know, we haven't seen our representative, they haven't been present. And so I think we have to be a connector. For me, if I know that a policy is coming down the line, as a connector, I am going to go into that community, start connecting them with the local, with the state, whatever level of government is on. And so I think for us, we sometimes say, oh, well, young people are fed up. But I think for us who have a seat at the table, we have to continue to find a way to bring my generation to the table, and that's through connecting them to whoever is connected to that policy. So a lot of organizations, you know, in your community or those connectors, right? And so educating people to go to those organizations like the NAACP, great connector to the Congress, to the Senate, and connecting them to that, I think is the first step, because we do know that in order for us to fill those gaps in regards to policy, it doesn't happen overnight, and their voices have to be elevated so that they're heard, right? You know, if we had the march on student loans right now, that if it lasts for a year in D.C., the president will act, right? There will be some type of response to that people, hundreds of thousands of people are standing in D.C. right now, and they are not going home until student loans are forgiven. The president will come out of the White House and act at some point, right? So we have to start strategizing and motivating people to think that way, to start organizing. I mean, we saw what happened with Representative Bush on the steps of the Capitol just a couple of months ago, right? We saw what happened when, you know, Cory Booker brought Congressman John Lewis out on the Capitol. We have to start applying that pressure so that your voices are elevated and heard before those policies are finalized.
I appreciate your referencing those two instances because actually myself and Representative Bush, Assistant Speaker Clark, and others who participated in acts of civil disobedience, either in the name of reproductive justice or voting rights or housing justice, there have been many who have offered that that's very undignified and actually not the role of a lawmaker. And I'll just say as a voter, you know, please, I have that expectation that my elected is going to bring activist leadership layered with their legislative and appropriations and budgetary advocacy, because we need all of it right now. And, you know, first thing is legislative, and after you've exhausted, you know, everything there, to me, it's like progressive discipline. That didn't work, and so now where are we taking this? On young people, I know there have been some strides taken in Massachusetts on this front. I believe that we need civic education and academies, both for young people in our schools as a part of that curriculum, but I want to say this also for adults. Because now that I'm in Congress and haven't been on the city council for 8 years, people are very confused about what happens at each level of government, what are the pressure points, who's accountable to them when, and about what. And I want young people to know that whether you are of voting age or not, we're still accountable to you. You are members of this community, and we are accountable to you, but they need that education in order to have that empowerment. And so I personally am supportive of a civics curriculum.
Maybe a quick point related to that. About 5 years ago, in the NAACP, we were realizing that our membership was primarily young people, because we have one of the largest young movements in the country, youth in college, all across the country. And then we have a lot of folks who come into the organization in their 45, 50, 60-year-old, that part of their life, but we were missing that gap between 25 and 45. And we started what we now call the Next Generation Leadership Program. We've graduated over 400 25 to 45-year-olds who get trained for a year, and they get to meet with elected officials. They get to deal with policy, how to write policy, think about policy. They get to engage voters. They're required to go out and engage people on, for anyone who's never done the battle of going out on the street and registering voters, I want to challenge you to try to do that. because people are going to tell you why they don't vote. And you got to then, in that few minutes you have, convince them that it's worth their time to actually show up. They're young, they're older, they're feeling disenfranchised. So we started this program. We now have hundreds of graduates across the country who are now leading branches, running for elected office, who come into that work with a centering in how do you bring people into the movement? How do you bring people into politics? We need to do more trainings like that, where we create an army of John Lewis's, and I hope we do that.
So before we depart, just New York University is one of our sponsors, and they have some goodies and light refreshments at the end of the program. Let's give our panel a hand. Thank you so much. See you tomorrow at 4 o'clock, Black Philanthropy. Thank you very much. Some goodies up front.